Hello and welcome to the ITSS Verona video podcast series. My name is Irene Senfter. I'm the lead of the Arctic desk at ITSS Verona. And with me today is my colleague from the Arctic desk, Max Giordano. Our topic today is China in the Arctic, but we will also discuss Antarctica and the third pole. And our guest today is Marco Volpe. Hello, Marco.
Hello.
Marco is a doctoral candidate at the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Lapland, and a visiting researcher at the Arctic Center in Rovaniemi. His research delves into the field of China's polar science diplomacy, where he investigates the interplay between science, policy, and international cooperation in the polar regions. Marco holds a master's in Eastern languages and cultures from the University of Rome, an MRes in East Asian Studies from the University of Leeds, and a Master's in Sustainable Development, Geopolitics of Resources, and Arctic Studies from the Italian Society for International Organization. Marco is currently working on 2 book chapters, focusing on the interplay of scientific research and Arctic governance in China's Arctic policy, and on China's domestic discourse on status building in the Arctic. His latest article, High Seas Triggering Arctic Security, an analysis of Chinese domestic discourse on the Central Arctic Ocean, was published in the Arctic Yearbook in 2023. Marco is also a member of ITSS Verona's expert team. Thank you for being with us today, Marco.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, and let's start with the questions. First question. Scholars and experts agree on the main challenges the Arctic region faces. Climate change is challenging the Arctic environment, the resilience of Arctic communities, Arctic governance, and the health of the planet at large. We have seen increased tension since 2014, and especially a freeze in East-West relations since 2022 have put on hold most interstate and circumpolar cooperation in the Arctic, have increased the potential for military cooperation, military escalation, and have put on hold the claim of high north, low tensions, and of the narrative of Arctic exceptionalism in the Arctic. Another defining challenge, the academic and policy communities agree, is China's current and future role in the Arctic. Marco, could you talk us through China's current engagement in the Arctic and its intentions? And give us your assessment of whether China represents a threat or an opportunity for Arctic governance and the balance of power in the Arctic.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Irene, for this very timely and interesting question. And I think we, in order to have like a picture of all of it, we need to go a bit back and to trace actually what is China, what has been in the last year Chinese Arctic engagement, and where are we now? And then I try to explain why I do not really see China as a threat for the Arctic. So at the moment, China is considered as still a newcomer in the Arctic, but it showed interest into the Arctic region back in the 20s when it joined the Svalbard Treaty. Over the years, of course, China has evolved these strategies alongside the role within the global politics from an emerging power when it started the opening up reform in the 80s with Deng Xiaoping to challenging the US as a big power and a rule-shaping actor also in the Arctic. So today we look at China in the Arctic as a state which can plan actually long-term strategy and with a leader, Xi Jinping, who is not internally challenged. So one thing that I really think that is quite important is also to understand that in order to look at Chinese foreign policy, we also need to understand Chinese domestic policy and what are the challenges that China is facing at the domestic level. So at the moment, China is facing many challenges that are related to the economic slowdown, the population decline, the aging demographics, the income inequality, and regional disparities, environmental degradation, and climate change. These are only some of the challenges that China is facing at domestic level. So that's why I think that the Arctic for China is not priority number one. And of course, I will not delve into all these domestic factors, but it's something that we need to take in mind. But if we look at the China as a big power in the Arctic, I think it's quite, it could be useful to use the statement that Professor Anne-Marie Brady from University of Canterbury gave in her book that was published in, if I'm not wrong, in 2017 or 18, where she states that to be a great polar power, a state must have high level of scientific capacity and scientific research funding, high level of presence in polar regions, significant economic, military, political, and diplomatic capacity, as well as high level of international engagement in polar governance. And I think that where we are now, we see actually China having almost all of these features. So in order to understand China, maybe is useful to China and the Arctic is useful to go to delve into different spheres, starting from scientific engagement, and then economics, geopolitical, strategic engagement, and environmental diplomacy. So looking at scientific engagement, China has established its research station in the Svalbard archipelago in 2004, and it serves as a base for a range of scientific activities that include atmospheric and climate research, monitoring marine ecosystem. It almost yearly launches Arctic expedition with the Xuelong and the Xuelong 2, which are which are the two polar icebreakers that China has at its disposal. Is now working on a third vessel, which most likely will not be a polar icebreaker, but will be utilized for scientific Arctic expeditions. And most notably, I think, is that the last research expedition brought Chinese scientists into the Galkel Reach, which is close to the Russian the Russian EEZ. So this is already considered a point of potential friction between Russia and China. So science for China is not only relevant for increased knowledge of the ecosystem, but also to engage with stakeholders and partners which are involved in scientific cooperation. Also among under some Arctic Council institutions, such as the Arctic Council, which has the working groups, which is the core of the Arctic Council, where all the scientific cooperation is actually developed. Looking at economic interest, and of course, we need to mention energy investments that China is trying to make in the Arctic. It has been mentioned about many projects that China tried to implement in the Arctic, but if we look at the reality on the ground, the reality is quite different, because at the moment, actually, the real projects that are running and that see Chinese participation are just few compared to the ones that were discussed in the beginning and some years back. One of the most important is, of course, the energy cooperation with Russia, and in the LNG project in Yamal Peninsula, liquefied natural gas project in Yamal Peninsula. Through stakes in this project, China, of course, gains access to a stable supply of energy resources at a convenient price. These investments are particularly appealing as they offer China an alternative source of natural gas and also diversifying its energy imports. But while this LNG project actually is running at its full potential, the construction of the LNG2, which is a twin project, has been slowed down because China has been afraid of running into sanctions, indirect sanction imposed on Russia by the US and the EU bloc. So at the moment, we see LNG1 running quite well, but LNG2 quite slowed down. And it is like maybe today or yesterday news that the last module of the project has been shipped from China to Russia. So maybe we will see next year the project starting to operate efficiently. And then we have, of course, the Northern Sea route that which runs along Russia's Arctic coastline, and which holds, of course, strategic importance, as it can actually shorten relatively the travel time between Asia and Europe. And for China, of course, it could mean reduced shipping costs, lower fuel consumption, and less time at sea, which are all factors that are very, very convenient in terms of economics and commercial benefits. But however, China, this is more my opinion, has not completely abandoned the possibility to navigate through the Central Arctic Ocean waters, which of course would enable China to not go through waters that are under Russian sovereignty. It would be like quite easier to navigate those waters, even if, of course, the capability depends on the polar icebreakers capacity. And then speaking always about economic interests, we cannot not mention the mining and infrastructure. Beyond energy, of course, China is interested in Arctic mineral resources, including rare earth elements. China is already leader in the market, holding maybe 80% of the market, has tried to invest, especially in Greenland recently, at least in the first 2 decades of the 2000s. But the most relevant project, which was in southern Greenland, in Vannefield, was actually stopped by the Greenlandic government, and also because of strong local pushbacks. So at the moment, the mining is not very beneficial for China as it is for the energy sector. Coming to the geopolitical and strategic engagement, of course, we see Sino-Russia partnership, and here I really want to stress this point that we are speaking about partnership and not an alliance, because I think there are very different priorities by China and Russia in the Arctic. And while, for example, Russia values China's support and investment, it still remains cautious of Chinese growing Arctic ambition and access. And on the other side, China takes advantage of convenient LNG prices while slowing down on energy project in Arctic, such as the LNG 2 and the Power of Siberia 2, which actually Russia would like to go like faster on these two projects. But again, China is quite skeptical about going faster because, again, could run into indirect sanction, would not also compromise the relation that it has with the US and with the EU economic partners in the Arctic. And coming to environmental, the last, let's say, sphere of Chinese engagement in the Arctic, we have, of course, environmental diplomacy, with China trying to contribute to scientific research and in order to also mitigate climate change's consequences. And in this term, I think it is quite relevant Chinese engagement in one of the international treaties that has been negotiated a few years ago, in 2021, the Senfter Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. If we not consider the Svalbard Treaty that was signed in 1925, this is the first international treaty that also involved non-Arctic states, such as China, Japan, Korea, and EU as a unique actor. So in these terms, I think that actually this also proves China's intention to be a more active part in Arctic governance, at least, and through scientific cooperation and through scientific research, China, I think, is finding the key to be more active, more included, and also to show a better image in terms of climate leadership in the Arctic. Coming to your last question, if I retain China a threat or opportunity in the Arctic, I think it really depends on the stakeholders that we take into consideration. I was in the Arctic Secretary Assembly in October last month, like 3 or 4 weeks ago. And if we consider the speech of Rob Bauer, who is the chair of the NATO Military Committee, the speech that he made echoed actually the one that was pronounced the year before, perceiving China as a potential threat in the Arctic for NATO. And if we look also at the US Arctic strategy, actually mentions that the People's Republic of China seeks to increase its influence in the Arctic through an expanded slate of economic, diplomatic, scientific, and military activities. However, in the last years, at least in the last 3 or 4 years, there is a growing literature that is challenging the idea about China having like a massive presence in the Arctic, as it was actually suggested in the at least 10, 15 years ago. So some statements that were made in 10, 15 to 20 years ago, and the reality on the ground about Chinese presence in the Arctic that do not really match. That is one relevant point, I think. And that is why I think that we do not, sorry, we do not need to consider China as a threat in traditional, in terms of traditional security terms. And China is not going to challenge the status quo of the Arctic, from which actually it is gaining commercial benefits, which is the top priority for China: stability and political stability that enable commercial benefits and commercial exchanges. This is the mantra that the CCP has been applying in many regional contexts, and the Arctic does not make any exception to that, I think. So the growing tension and growing polarization, not of course beneficial for the party purposes, especially in the Arctic, where China is interested in doing business with Russia and European and American economic partners. This is very important to understand, I think. And of course, the way I see China moving in the next years will be really shaped by how also the situation will evolve at domestic level again, which actually present like the hardest and harsh challenges for China at the moment. And of course, I think that mostly will depend on how the Ukrainian conflict will evolve now that there is a new administration in the US. So I hope I answered, and your question gave a comprehensive scenario of China's Arctic engagement.
Very comprehensive. Thank you indeed. This was a very good analysis. We have to be a bit mindful of time, but our second question should focus on your own research, Marco, because you have just returned from an extended research trip to China, where you had the possibility to engage with the Chinese academic community and gauge Chinese Arctic scholarships, assessments, and ideas about China's current and future role in the Arctic. So could you maybe share some of the insights with us that were most striking to you? For example, what is the main difference between Western and Chinese Arctic scholarship? Is the Western academic community reading China correctly? Where is China heading to in the Arctic according to Chinese Arctic scholarship? And to what extent can or should we assume that outputs of Chinese Arctic scholarship are part of state propaganda or feedback into China's Arctic policies?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be a bit faster. So, my last time in China was quite interesting because it was my first time since 10 years. So I actually found a very completely different China. And I found an extremely technological society, less polluted cities, and very high quality of services. So on one side, of course, you can see that Chinese society is moving towards high digitalized society with a stricter control on personal activities because, of course, traceability of people movements. So I spent most of my time in the Nordic Center in Fudan University in Shanghai, where I had the opportunity to conduct my fieldwork and attend many workshops related to Chinese position in the current world order and also related to the Belt and Road, the BRI project. I actually found that most of the discussion about academics in China and also Western scholars in China is still focused on the BRI, which is facing, as we know, a lot of challenges, especially because of this unstable political situation in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. But speaking with Chinese colleagues, I was actually surprised by the level of criticism that they spoke about regarding some initiatives launched by Xi Jinping, for example, the zero COVID policy, which in Shanghai was very, very, very harsh. And so it was quite striking speaking with them openly about the challenges that they had to cope with during the the time of COVID, especially in the last period when we in Europe were experiencing completely different experience and completely different life. About Chinese Arctic research, I think that is constantly growing in the domain of natural science, but also in social science. Of course, it's not at the level of Nordic countries, but it's rapidly growing, and it sees the engagement of many different universities, such as the Shanghai Ocean University, Ocean University of China in Qingdao, Tongji University, Beijing Normal University, Harbin Engineering University, and Peking University. This actually shows how much China and the Communist Party is also investing in science and in research that is related to polar domains. About how the Western literature is reading China, I think this is very, very interesting question because it actually brings me back to the core question of my PhD project. Because I started from the point of challenging the speculation that were related to Chinese Arctic role. I started my PhD in 2021, so of course the political situation was completely different. But already a few years back, most of the China Arctic-related literature was focused on concerns about China being a threat, not only from a traditional security perspective, but also with the possibility of high deep penetration in Nordic economies of China by China, especially to those economies that are more fragile, such as, for example, the Greenlandic economy that still depends on huge financial aid by Copenhagen, for example. However, I soon realized that there was not so much attention on the academic domestic debate. So what about what the Chinese domestic scholars were thinking and were discussing about China's Arctic engagement, and also the relation that there is between the epistemic community in China and the policymakers. So, what is the relation between them? I actually speak about this in the article that you mentioned, that was published in the Arctic Yearbook in 2023. And what emerges is that actually there is a fil rouge between the academic and political debate in China, but still the academics have a stronger voices about the current Arctic governance. This does not really provide enough room for China to accept the legitimate rights. So from the academic point of view, there are still some criticism about the Arctic governance. But most generally, I found that the discussion between the politicians and discussion between the academics are quite aligned, that perceiving China as a cooperative actor in the Arctic rather than an hegemonic power looking for altering the status quo. So the mantra that actually governed the academic debate is cooperation over confrontation. And last point about Sino-Russian partnership, again, partnership, is that China and Russia have aligned interest in the Arctic domains that comes with energy and development of the Arctic shipping routes. However, Russia is very severe on sovereignty of the Northern Sea route and also looks with some concern the Chinese activity in the Gulf Reach, for example. And pushed for accelerating on the LNG2 and Power of Siberia 2, where China is trying to slow down a bit. So there are some points that are not quite convergent between China and Russian policies. So that's a point that actually the Western literature should look into more, I think, because here I think that the discussion is focused too much on perceiving China and Russia partnership as more as an alliance, but I don't really agree with that opinion.
Okay, Marco, thank you very much. Certainly, being able to access Chinese documents and researchers in the original language makes for much more nuanced analysis, so thank you for this. For our third and last question, I hand over to my colleague Max. Max, the floor is yours.
Hello, Marco. Thank you for your time. So I'll make my question as succinct as possible. I wanted to widen the scope a little bit. Specifically, when we think of the Arctic, the focus has been on Svalbard, the Barents Sea, and generally northern approaches. But that often neglects the wider geography that includes Pacific Arctic, Antarctica, and as Irene mentioned, the third pole, referring to the Himalayas. These places are interconnected in many different ways, and so climate shifts in the Arctic affect global systems, impacting Antarctica and the Himalayas, and the latter where melting glaciers threaten water security, ecosystems, and of course geopolitics. And so the core focus is to kind of understand these feedback loops that help us anticipate the shared vulnerabilities and kind of the effects on security and local communities. So I have a series of questions. Firstly, what lessons for Arctic governance and what lessons for Arctic governance can be drawn from these links? Does China play a role or have a strategy for Antarctica and the third pole? We spoke about the Arctic a lot. And lastly, what can be implied about China's overall polar strategy and its role in different regional and in international orders as well?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's quite interesting because this also brings me back to a personal experience that I have with my Arctic Center team. In September last year, my team at the Arctic Center and we organized a conference in Kathmandu focusing on the interconnection between the third pole and the Arctic, trying to understand what are the similarities and the differences between the two poles. Let's call them like this. In terms of natural science, but also we explore some social science. We had a very strong feedback about the necessity to build bridges between the scientific community, between the Arctic and the third pole, because of course there are shared experiences. And when we speak, of course, about the third pole, we intend the Hindu-Kush Himalaya. And we know that these regions differ profoundly in terms of legal and political landscape, but the way that we centered the conference was on cryosphere. Cryosphere as an element that is shared between the two regions and that actually helped to, facilitate the discussion that was developed in the conference. We are two main topics actually emerged from many topics, but two of the most relevant were the status and the role of indigenous people in the policymaking process, and also the traditional embracing the traditional knowledge in the policymaking process alongside with Western science paradigms. Not only Western science, but also local tradition and traditional knowledge. At the moment, we are working on the second conference that will be hopefully held next year always in Kathmandu in partnership with Isimot. So I think that we can keep this conversation going ahead between the third pole and the Arctic. Speaking about the Antarctic, China and Antarctica have a long history, maybe even longer if we don't consider the Svalbard Treaty. China has recently established fifth research station in the continent. The Qingli station was actually inaugurated in February 2024, and it is a yearly round managed station that can host up to 80 scientists. And these numbers are massive if we consider the Antarctic, because having 80 scientists working the whole year are impressive numbers. And China joined the Antarctic in 1983 and established the first research station, the Zhongshan station, in the same year. And as we know, the Antarctic is governed by an international treaty which prioritizes scientific research and put on hold sovereignty claims advanced by climate state. So lately, the treaty is based on consensus-based system, which gives China and all the consultative parties the power to stop or prevent any conservation measures that is discussed. So a lot of this discussion now going on about China is that there is the position that China is having in stopping some of the marine protected areas to be implemented because of lack of scientific data. So I see this position actually proves, I'm not a scientist, so I cannot say whether it is relevant or not, but what I can see here is that China is having a more assertive role within this international paradigms that also prove how Chinese scientific engagement, Chinese scientific investments will help China in having always a more assertive role also in the Antarctic. So if we look generally at the polar strategy, there are some final consideration that we need to make. I think first, China can plan long term, which is quite different from many Arctic states and also states that are involved in the Antarctic domain. And investment in science will be the lens to understand China's future role in the polar domains, both in the Antarctic, where the treaty gives privilege to scientific purposes, as well as in the Arctic, where science is the key to play a more influential role within the governance mechanism. And being leader in climate science, data gathering on polar ice, ocean currents, and ecosystem changes is critical for understanding global climate pattern and Chinese contributions. And it threatens, of course, his credibility in the scientific community. So if we really want to understand China's approach to polar domains, we really need to understand where China is going domestically and where is investing and why is investing so much in science and technology. And this is relevant for the Arctic region, for the Himalaya region, and for the Antarctic region, which of course have like completely different regional and legal landscape, but the Chinese policy, adapts to every different scenarios. So I hope that I answer your very broad question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marco. Thank you for all of your valuable insights. It's clear that, I suppose, understanding the interconnectedness of these regions is crucial. To all of our viewers and listeners, for more discussions like this, please visit our website for additional video podcasts and publications from ITSS Verona at itssverona.it. Thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you for having me.